you give some examples in the piece of like culturally that sense. I mean, what do you think? I mean, give us the order of these things, because we have this crash in 2008. The economy is really devastated, and we have our unemployment rate doubles in the matter of like 12 months. It seemed like, and so it influenced everything. But there was this sort of, I guess, this morality of austerity that comes down the pike.
Right. So, yeah, and I think there's a couple of things that happen. And so in a timeline, you want to think of the financial crisis, which in some ways is kind of the least interesting part. I mean, it's unfortunate that we didn't cut bankers' pay or anything like that, or no one went to jail. But when we think about what really happened that was alongside that was the foreclosure crisis, which I really think really did remake the landscape for a lot of places. States that were the hardest hits obviously had huge foreclosure waves, but even places like the upper Midwest, where you can see polling and some preliminary studies that say places that are still underwater, places where people owe more on their mortgages that than the property is worth, which is a direct consequence of the recession and the financial crisis. They were more likely to vote for Trump. And so you see a couple of things, right? So you see the foreclosure wave, which really does remake the landscape, so that a lot of places where there's at least some density and some life, even if factories have closed, just hollow out. People aren't building places. People aren't upkeeping places. You have a lot of property, a shadow inventory of homes where just no one's living in them. They're falling apart into disarray. And I think that characterizes a lot of it. And then the second half of that is the geographic inequality, that you have really booming cities that are just out of control expensive. And so you have young people not forming families, not buying places, living in smaller and smaller places. I live in D.C. now, and I was in Brooklyn before. And, micro units are a big thing now, which is less than 400 square feet, which causes like a culture of just having to pare down just because you don't have room for stuff or you can't afford it.
There's also that I noticed over these past 8 years, that sort of the rise of I don't know how to say this, increasing your personal productivity, right? Like all of these sort of attempts at, and maybe it's just because I occasionally listen to that Tim Ferriss podcast, but it's all about, you had this rise of like data journalism, but I think so much of it seems to be about efficiency, right? Like you've got to be as productive as you possibly can, because things have become hyper competitive.
Exactly. So, one big thing that starts in the Obama years is the iPhone's introduced and smartphones are introduced. I actually had this in there when we took it out, but like the iPhone is introduced, I think 3 months before then Senator Obama's speech saying he was going to run for president. And I think that's a really interesting thing, because smartphones obviously help us not get lost and do a lot of fun things, but they also really ring you to your work, and they always make you feel like you have to be on, that there's something you're missing, that they really changed our cultural life in this way that has social consequences, but also has huge economic consequences. Another thing that really happens in starting this period is the workplaces become a lot more disassembled at contracting work, at call work. Part-time or non-traditional work really grows substantially. It grows from about 10 to 15% and kind of represents on net the kind of job growth we've seen in the past 8 years. And that work, a lot of people think you can kind of get into this elite Silicon Valley and often democratic elite mindset that this stuff is like fantastic because everyone's an entrepreneur and a small business owner. But for most people, it just means they get fired and hired back as a contractor with less rights, less wages, and a greater sense of they always have to be on and always have to be performing or they're going to lose their jobs.
And you also talk about the aspect of like tech, where there's this sort of movement, particularly like with the Silicon Valley, entrepreneurs, to be almost like these modern vagabonds.
Yeah, it's a thing that you wouldn't suspect, because we think of billionaires, right, and millionaires as having mansions and fleets of jets and stuff. But for a certain class of kind of tech stuff, there is this kind of sense of non-permanence as a lifestyle choice. So you see, there's this big thing about the Marie Kondo paring down, like throw away everything that doesn't bring you joy, kind of stuff. But there's an aesthetic lifestyle choice to really like have very few possessions. Maybe like only live in Airbnbs and only use an Uber to get around. And the idea that you could kind of get away with a hyper minimalism, and not just that kind of like sleek modernism that came with Mad Men, which was obviously the big show of the Obama years, where everything's very modern and it's sleek. It's way beyond that, and it became almost a competitive race. And you see it with something. There's a great article. I forget the writer's name, but it's called Airspace. But this kind of aesthetic where everything's kind of like very industrial, but like scrubbed away of any kind of the grittiness, so like the exposed wood and lighting fixtures of the period. And it's a very classist way, because for people who can do this, they're saying they're not worried that they're not going to be able just to buy whatever they need when they need it. So they don't need to save any physical possessions. It's the opposite of the kind of World War II generation that really did want to like can everything and hold everything down.
Hey, it's Sam Seder. Why don't you subscribe to this channel? You can do so right over here. Subscribe.